Hello, everybody. My name is Evangelos Koциorис. I'm an architectural historian and currently a curatorial assistant at the Department of Architecture and Design in New York. Today I will be speaking about Alfred H. Barr Jr.'s trip to Moscow and the ВХУТЕМАСe school in 1928. And for those who might not be familiar with the name, Alfred Barr was the first director of the Museum of Modern Art. So, as an introduction, this project that I'm going to elaborate on started a couple of years ago when a colleague of mine, Megan Forbes, and I organized a small exhibition called Intersecting Parallels, Bauhaus and ВХУТЕМАСe at the Library of the Museum of Modern Art on the opportunity of the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus. Of course, there was a lot of events that year, and we thought it would be an opportunity to actually position the ВХУТЕМАSe's importance within the larger setting of the museum, because the majority of our audience is not necessarily familiar with the school. So one way that we did that was actually to create a mapping of all the social networks of people between the two schools who had multiple exchanges in physical space and also through publications, letters, correspondence, travel, all sorts of different platforms. In this process, we realized also the importance of publications in particular as a site of construction of discourse rather than just a mere carrier of conversation. So this is a kind of a very humble display that we put together at MoMA to show these points of interaction between these two seemingly disparate cultures, or what have been perceived as parallel ones, and the way it was displayed in the library. And this resulted in two original research papers that Megan and I wrote for POST, which is the online journal of the Contemporary Modern Art Perspectives group at the museum that can be accessed online. To backtrack a bit, the Museum of Modern Art was established in 1929 in New York. It was the initiative of three New York women, Lily Bliss, Mary Queen Sullivan, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And after asking for recommendations who might be the appropriate person to run the endeavor, they concluded that Alfred Barr, a young art historian who had been trained at Harvard, would be the right person to do so. And back in 1929, the Museum of Modern Art occupied a very small footprint, just a few rooms inside the Hexler building at 730 Fifth Avenue in New York. And on November 7, 1929, opened its doors with its inaugural installation, which was an exhibition with loans of paintings by Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh. Some of the main figures that Barr considered as the propeller in the torpedo of modern art, to use his own metaphor. So in a way, one can see this intention to create a kind of genealogy of the modern movement, which today we know is kind of problematic and tries to shoehorn certain tendencies and figures and outcomes out of a much more broader and diverse picture. And before establishing the mission for MoMA, 2 years prior to that, Barr was actually teaching at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, a women's college, and later at Boston University. And it was at Wellesley that Barr is credited with establishing the first course on modern art and architecture, and a series of lectures that he gave at the Farnsworth Museum, which actually gave the ground for many of the alumni to pursue a career in modern art inside the United States and abroad. And here, I just mentioned three of the women that came out of the program: Ernestine Flandel, who became an editor of the London Sunday Times; Catherine Stern, who was an art reviewer for the New York Times; and Ellen Frank, who over time ended up being a senior editor at MoMA's Department of Publications. Now, in the fall of 1927, and in preparation of this series of lectures and courses that Barr was organizing at Wellesley, he took an extended trip through Europe, visiting familiar stops in Germany, including the Bauhaus in Dessau, meeting with Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Paul Klee, many of the familiar figures that we might know from that period and time and place. And it was towards the end of 1927 that Barr and his co-traveler, Jer Abbott, whom you can see here in this photograph in the middle, decided to take a last-minute detour and visit the Soviet Union for 2 or 3 weeks. And they ended up staying for 1.5 months approximately, which is quite a long stay if one considers this was a very last-minute detour. And in particular, Barr wanted to visit not only the members of the Russian avant-garde who had gained notoriety in the United States, but also in particular to visit the ВХУТЕМАСе school and see how that enacted its pedagogy and how did the members teaching there produce the work that they did. So he actually ended up visiting the school 3 times with Barr in January of 1928. And the title of my presentation is Lost in Translation, because neither him nor Abbott, that you can see in the middle here, would speak Russian. So they had to rely not only on the help of an external translator, whom you see in this commemorative picture, the only one from this trip that we have left. But they also had constantly to negotiate, renegotiate, and try to understand how the Russian development of art, abstraction, and all the other tenets of what they considered modern art actually enveloped and developed in Russia. So we're talking about a constant act of translation, decoding, deciphering, and you can see even that, for instance, giving an interview to a Russian interview for them was not easy as well. They had to use the services of a translator. And this is just one of the clippings that are in Barr's own papers from an interview he gave with Abbott to the newspaper Zvezda in Novgorod while on a visit there. So we see Barr and Abbott collecting all this information that they might not be able to readily process. And as a result, what one notices in this trip is this incredible intensity with which Barr and Abbott collect printed material, information, and notes in order to piece together and make sense of this exciting narrative of Russian modern art and architecture when they return back home. One of the main documents in this process was actually Barr's own diary, titled Russian Diary 1927-28, which exists at the Museum of Modern Art as a copy and an original at Harvard's Houghton Library. And it's interesting to note that one of the kind of synopsizing comments that Barr had about the school of the ВХУТЕМАСe at the time was that the whole institution seemed painfully lacking in organization and equipment, but the fine spirit of enthusiasm will conquer these technical difficulties with time and money. It was annoying, though, not to find any printed material about the school, not even a list of professors or courses. So unlike the vast publicity machine of the Bauhaus that produced a series of publications, pamphlets, catalogs, postcards, etc., Barr seems to not be able to find the same kind of material readily available at the ВХУТЕМАСe. But of course, we know today that there was a plethora of extremely exquisitely designed material in that sense, starting with Lisitsky's book on the architecture of the ВХУТЕМАСe in the middle, as well as other publications from the different factions of the school, newspapers, short-lived brochures, or journals, and so on and so forth. But many of these publications were actually printed in low print runs, like 1,000 copies, so perhaps they were not really readily available, forcing the two foreigners to actually amass a vast amount of ephemera or anything that they could really get their hands on. And here I'm showing you just a selection of the reference material that exists in more than 60 folders of archival material in Barr's personal papers at the Museum of Modern Art. So again, if one considers the kind of last-minute nature of the trip, bringing back to the US 60 folders of material is not a small feat, especially back in the day, but it also attests to their intense desire to try to decode the work done at the school at the time. So going through some of the visits that this trip amounted to, on January 3rd, 1928, Barr met with architect, artist, designer, and typographer Lisitsky, who taught architecture, interiors, and furniture design at the ВХУТЕМАСe. In his diary, Barr describes Lisitsky's designs as quite ingenious, this refers to both the book designs that he saw and also the photographs of him, of his. Lisitsky must have also shown Barr about his audacious design for the Wolkenbügel, known in English as the cloud iron, which was a network of horizontally expanding skyscrapers positioned at major intersections across Moscow. An image of which you can see here from the newspaper of Osnova, the Association of New Architects within the school of the ВХУТЕМАСe, led by architect Nikolai Ladovsky. Now, Barr is quick to consider this proposition as, quote, the most frankly paper architecture I have ever seen. So it's kind of a shocking encounter. Barr arrives there expecting to see a much more traditional architectural material and sees this kind of impossible projects of sorts. Abbott, on the other hand, really true to the nature of the paper architecture project, seems to reenact Lisitsky's paper architecture himself, sketching a perspective view of the daring cantilever design under his diary entry for that day, concluding by writing that it is very interesting to see how careful these former painters are to repudiate painting. So again, there's a kind of a dissonance between the expectation or what they expected to find there with what really amounts out of this visit. Now, the afternoon of the same day, Barr and Abbott also met with Alexander Rodchenko, who was teaching furniture design at the ВХУТЕМАСe, and Varvara Stepanova, only secondarily described in many ways in his diary as the talented wife. And this kind of first encounter took place at their apartment, and language again was an obstacle, as both of these, quote, brilliant, versatile artists, in Barr's view, only spoke Russian, of course. And as early as 1921, both Stepanova and Rodchenko had famously abandoned painting or to fully devote to photography, advertising, textile design, and all kinds of other media. And a seemingly unsatisfied Barr insists to look at their older abstract paintings, which he hoped to see, which he's surprised to find, quote, preceding the earliest geometrical things I've seen, unquote. And while impressed with their masterful photographs, Barr is determined, quote, to find some painters if possible. So again, there's a kind of almost conservative approach to what the outcome of the Russian creators and teachers at the ВХУТЕМАСe might be at the time. Recalling the incident from a different angle, Stepanova, whose authorship in many of these works we know much more today, of course, and appreciate, writes, quote, those Americans came to call one of them dull, dry, and bespectacled, Professor Alfred Barr, is only interested in art, painting, drawing, etc. He turned our whole apartment upside down. They made us show them all kinds of old junk. Towards the end, Barr got all hot and bothered. And so for Stepanova, Barr's uptight character and inquiries were indicative of an academic who seemed stuck in a bygone era of fine art and non-mechanical media. Instead, as Stepanova mentions elsewhere, I'm absolutely not interested in this anymore. The soul is already filled with photography.